Hi, everybody. My name is Sebastian Brunemeier. Looking forward to presenting to you today. I will just share my screen. Thanks again to the conference organizers. It's nice to be back. Last year was quite good, and this year has an excellent lineup as well. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about building and investing in longevity biotech, or Long Bio. My background is general partner at Healthspan Capital and CEO at ImmuneAGE Pharma. So the overview of the presentation today, talk a bit about my own background, about Healthspan Capital, overview of the Biopharma Machine, the mechanics of it all, long bio as an investment theme, a snapshot of the cast of characters in the long bio space, this new checklist we call the legit long bio checklist, as well as some closing thoughts. So who am I? Look myself in the mirror and ask myself every day. But for the purposes of this talk, I've been in the long bio space for about a decade now. My training is in molecular neuroscience and biotech business management, as well as part of a PhD at Oxford, which I paused to do biotech. I've been affiliated with a bunch of other academic institutions as well. I transitioned into the biotech space some years ago, starting with Apollo Health Ventures, which today is the largest aging-focused venture capital fund with $200 million under management. I launched a company called Samsara Therapeutics, which is one of the first autophagy-enhancing platform companies. So we're doing drug discovery for autophagy enhancement. And that's in Oxford, UK. Then I co-founded a company called Cambrian Biopharma, which is today one of the larger and more prominent aging-focused drug discovery companies with about $160 million raised and up to about 20 assets in the portfolio. And recently, I've co-founded Healthspan Capital, investing in longevity biotech and regenerative medicine, as well as ImmuneAGE Pharma around immune system rejuvenation. And this is a platform company. So Healthspan Capital, we invest in long bio and regenerative medicine for healthy lifespan extension. This is a snapshot of our team, who have been affiliated with many different research institutions and pharmas. And our investment theses are pretty simple. So longevity biotech is the next paradigm of medicine, targeting root causes of disease. We know that drugs that enhance resilience and extend healthy lifespan across species will work for multiple diseases. We call this a pipeline in a pill. And these are safe enough to dose long-term, because if you give it to an animal for most of its life, that's a pretty good toxicology study. Some of these drugs, like rapamycin or the SGLT2 inhibitors, which make you pee out extra glucose, already work for multiple diseases in humans. But pharma has neglected to target the hallmarks of aging. Fortunately, the tide is turning and prominent names are catching on. So why Healthspan Capital? So we wanted to invest in a fund like this, but nothing like it existed. There is, of course, Apollo Ventures, but Apollo is focused on company building and has a concentrated portfolio. Whereas we are a little bit more like a traditional VC in that we're writing a larger number of checks to a larger number of companies, and we're not necessarily building them ourselves. So we're more diversified, and economist Harry Markowitz, a Nobel laureate, said diversification is the only free lunch in finance. And we have pretty good deal flow, and this field is growing exponentially. Nathan and I have pretty good network centrality. We know many of the players in the space, and Nathan runs the most prominent website for everything you want to know about long bio, as well as one of the most subscribed newsletters in the space. We also provide a lot of hands-on support for early stage teams. So we don't tend to invest in later stage companies, but we like to invest in companies where we can actually add a lot of value, for example, at the board level. So according to Bank of America Merrill Lynch, by 2025, the market for longevity therapeutics will be $500 billion. That seems a little optimistic based on the current pace, but I don't think it's too far off in the longer term. You guys in this conference will all know these big players, Altos and Calico, getting into the space. And by the way, I'm going to go through a lot of slides quickly, so this is intended for you guys to pause and you can read the slides at your leisure. So our portfolio within Healthspan, we've done about 12 deals in the last 4 quarters. Some of these you guys will recognize: Deciduous Therapeutics targeting senescent cells by reactivating the immune system, Equator Therapeutics inducing mitochondrial thermogenesis as a CR mimetic. This could be the best-selling drug of all time if it works. Shift Bioscience on transient reprogramming using non-Yamanaka factors or Yamanaka mimetic factors. Repair Bio, which is working on cleaning out the vasculature in atherosclerosis, the leading cause of death, and this is a macrophage engineering approach. Immunis, which is using stem cell-derived immune secretome to rejuvenate particularly muscle function, but also immune function. Matter Bio, repairing somatic DNA mutations that accumulate with age. One of the co-founders is George Church. This could be a new spell check mechanism, similar to something that could be as important as CRISPR. Molecule, which is a Web3 platform to facilitate the creation of DAOs, including VitaDAO, the first longevity DAO. Zoe Biosciences, which is targeting a number of interesting targets shown in long-lived humans to be beneficial. We've recently invested, and these are not announced, in Youth Biotherapeutics doing epigenetic reprogramming, Keto Swiss doing exogenous ketone chemistry for brain energy metabolism, Immune Bridge, which is working on cord blood-derived NK cells and other immune cell therapies, and of course VitaDAO, which is the first longevity DAO, which you'll hear more about in the near future. So the the field, the longevity biotech field, companies referring to themselves as such, is rising exponentially. This is data from my Healthspan co-founder and friend, Nathan Chang, and you can check out his website, longevitylist.com, which is fantastic. It's a database of companies and investors and job postings in the space, and he keeps track of the amount of capital coming in as well. Here's a screenshot of the database for companies, but you can see many other factors as well. This I call the social proof slide. So who are the famous and influential people investing in Longbio? This is only in the last several years, but you'll notice some big names here. I won't call out anyone in particular, but a lot of them are quite famous. Okay, I will call out Stanley Druckenmiller, who is like the most successful macro hedge fund manager of his generation, as well as Vitalik Buterin, co-inventor of Ethereum, and many other smart people and companies investing in the space too. And it's funny because 10 years ago when I got into the field, it was pretty much Peter Thiel and a little bit Bob Nelson in the space, and it was very fringe, but now it's become fashionable. So let's talk about the biopharma machine itself. So I call this a wiring diagram of the biomedical economy, and we can zoom in. So it starts with the public. Capital goes to the NIH, now $45 billion a year, goes to universities. Universities do the research that yields the IP that can be spun off into biotech companies, or increasingly by venture capital funds that are company builders, such as Apollo or Cambrian, which is not a fund. In addition, the capital from the public goes into the public markets as well as private markets, become through your pension fund or insurance fund or endowment. You become a limited partner in venture funds as well as private equity funds, and also investing directly into publicly listed equities. And that capital all flows into biotech and Big Pharma. Big Pharma is the major customer for biotech developed assets. So what happens is for pretty much all the preclinical development and early clinical development, it's done in small biotech companies, which are more nimble and have certain advantages. And then when there's some kind of really compelling data, pharma acquires for quite a premium. And the biopharma pipelines are running dry, which is favorable to company builders. And then Big Pharma works with CROs, contract research organizations, both preclinical and clinical, to do this work, shows the data to regulators. Then the regulators approve or not, and then the payers can reimburse. That's another level of decision making on the quality of that drug or therapy. And then the final layer is whether healthcare providers prescribe it or not. So this is the general overview of how capital flows. So I think these are the halcyon years of longevity biotech that we're about to enter into. So I think we're at the right place at the right time. This is out of date. There was a biotech mania. I think on a secular basis, it's going to come back. We've only just, with the recent crash, reverted to the 5-year trend line. There's a demographic aging crisis that's going to persist, the silver tsunami, we call it. Pharma is winding down internal R&D, so biotech has to step into the breach. There's a higher and higher bar expected for therapeutic safety and efficacy. So regulators and the public are no longer satisfied with this sort of incremental progress and symptom palliation. The low-hanging fruit has been picked. And so now we need to go more apical in the cause of disease. And there are breakthroughs in the biology of aging happening every day, but especially in the last 20 years. The field has grown exponentially. And there are new models, lower cost, more capital efficient models, virtual biotech models for early drug discovery and even clinical development using CROs that are getting ever more sophisticated. Big Pharma is actually, to their credit, catching on pretty quickly to Long Bio, but historically they've been asleep at the wheel. So to quote from this book, Real World Drug Discovery, the former president of R&D at Roche, Jürgen Drews, said, biotech industry is increasingly taking up what the pharma industry is neglecting, namely carrying out future-directed research, creating the conditions for the discovery of new classes of medicines that attack more directly the root causes of disease, and what could be more at the root cause than aging itself. David Baltimore, the storied scientist and Nobel laureate and president of Caltech, said, regarding the biotech revolution in the 90s, pharma was asleep at the wheel, unable to understand the profound opportunities provided by molecular biology, therefore unable to take advantage of them. And then henceforth, Genentech and Amgen and the rest took over. So Big Pharma is sort of facing an existential crisis over the last decade or so. They're actually losing money on their internal R&D. So their internal rate of return is less than their weighted average cost of capital. So they're burning investors' money. And so to their credit, they're actually outsourcing a lot of the R&D to small biotech companies. So this is some data from Andrew Lowe's group. Andrew Lowe is a professor at MIT, and he has shown that there's been a sea change in the source of the best-selling drugs. So in the year 2000, the top-selling drugs, best-selling drugs, shown here in white, highlighted in white, came from Big Pharma internal R&D. And the blue ones were acquisitions from biotechs or biotech-derived assets. So 13% were from academia and biotech versus Big Pharma internal R&D. Fast forward to 2018, the top-selling drugs, it's a sea of blue here, top-selling drugs all derived from university spinouts and small biotech companies, so now 80%, and that trend is only accelerating. The problem is it's kind of cumbersome to out-license assets from academia and build a team around them and so forth. So there's this valley of death around biotech startup creation, and fortunately there are a lot of groups coming up with new ways to remedy that. And there's some very good news also coming from Andrew Lowe's group. You can look this up, projectalpha.mit.edu, in which he's showing in the last just 3 years or so, You can look at the black line. The probability of success from phase 1 clinical trial all the way to approval has effectively tripled. And Andrew Lo himself attributes this to mostly drugs being derived from small biotechs and academia, where the incentives are better aligned, as well as some advantages around targeting diseases where the pathophysiology is better understood, like rare diseases and genetic diseases. So Big Pharma is just less efficient than startups. So this data from Babe Ridge Bio shows that for every $1 billion spent, pharma, by their own estimate, gets less than 1 drug approved, whereas startups in aggregate get 4.5 drugs approved per $1 billion. Okay, so about 8 times as efficient. Similar data from McKinsey supports this in terms of new NDA filings coming from startups versus established pharma. Fortunately, though, pharma has these very profitable franchises, and so they're sitting on a lot of cash. So pharma, in aggregate, Big Pharma could acquire every single other company in the NASDAQ, especially at these current prices. This was, 2 years. These data were from some years ago. Especially today, pharma could easily buy all of the other publicly listed biotech companies out there, and probably a lot of private ones too. So, puts us in a good position to outsource or outlicense assets from academia, build teams, get to the key value inflection points, and then sell these assets to pharma. So there's a term that I coined in 2019 because there was no such term for this in existence, to my surprise, which is called the DISCO, the Distributed Drug Discovery Company. And this I coined as we were launching Cambrian. So biopharma business models can be groovy. So DISCOs, sometimes called a subsidiary portfolio model. We're not the first to come up with this. There are a bunch of other groups out there. McKinsey has done an analysis finding that a lot more capital is flowing into this business model. So in the longevity space, you have Cambrian, Juvenescence, Rejuveron, Maximon. These are sort of diversified companies with a top co and then subsidiaries. But there were others that were our predecessors, like Bridge Bio and Roivant and others, many others. And then you have these fund structures, these venture capital trusts that are tax privileged in the UK. That you should look into. So what are the advantages? We have an early R&D focus, but we're diversified and capital light. So these are the highest value inflection points prior to clinical development. The people within these subsidiaries have skin in the game because the operators hold equity and they have a lot more autonomy over the operations. It's almost like more like a venture fund with portfolio companies. It's similar to pharma's attempt at decentralization, these centers of excellence, which GSK called them, but it hasn't really worked that well for them. If your subsidiary project fails, you can come back into the mothership and do it again. This incentivizes truth-seeking behavior, as Bruce Booth calls it, and incentivizes a clean kill when things are not going to work out. So it's a decentralized hub-and-spoke model with a global reach. We can operate anywhere, really, to arbitrage IP from the world and certain universities into the US market. We also provide central services to the portfolio companies, which is a lot more efficient, and I'll get into that. There's another term that I want to coin for the first time today, which is called a SNAC, sort of a tongue-in-cheek one, but it's a single novel asset company. And so most investors fear the binary option nature of betting on a single asset. This is why platforms and discos are more attractive from a diversification standpoint. There are many other reasons as well, sort of longevity of the entity. One advantage of the disco is that you can develop multiple SNACs under a single umbrella, which gives you an advantage in recruiting talent, because really rockstar talent is not going to want to bet their next 5 years of their careers on a single asset. No matter how compelling that asset is, it's just very risky for them. But science advances one hypothesis or asset at a time, and focus is good. So if you can get a team to really narrowly focus on something, that's advantageous. Pharmas are kind of like discos, except that the team members at the SNAC level, there are no SNACs within pharmas, really. They don't have equity or skin in the game, and incentives really matter, and they're mired in bureaucracy. So one example of this working somewhat well was when Roche acquired Genentech, and they kind of left Genentech off to do its own thing, but they've slowly sort of encroached and made it less innovative and more bureaucratic. So there's this sort of corrupting influence of big pharma bureaucracy. So as I said, they're bureaucratic. Big Pharma's only spend a small fraction of revenue on R&D, and it's mostly late-stage clinical trials. It's not actual science, even though they portray themselves as doing so. They spend at least double on marketing budget than on R&D as a percentage of revenue. So the highest spending R&D big pharmas are Novartis and Roche, the Swiss giants, and they spend 15% of R&D or 15% of revenue on R&D. But others like Pfizer only spend 3%. So that's a bit of an issue because it means nobody's really doing early stage drug discovery. Also, don't be confused with SNAC with 2 C's, which is another word for cutie on the internet. As you can see, a whole snack. This cat is admiring this burger here. All right, so a bit about the corporate structure. You have a disco, represented by the disco ball here. It does fundraising because it's a diversified portfolio with a talented group of fundraisers and has established a name for itself and can go public. It's got a lower cost of capital. And there are central services provided by that team. Chemistry, pharmacology, toxicology, clinical regulatory, legal, operations, HR, et cetera, so that these portfolio company management teams don't have to worry about all of the ancillary stuff. They can really just focus on their core asset or set of assets. So you can have multiple SNACs, you can have a platform company within the top co with its own set of assets, and you can have minority stakes, almost like a venture fund, where you have less than 51% controlling interest. And then with those subsidiaries, you can exit them, IPO or M&A, or do partnerships and bring in non-dilutive capital. So this is really the structure that I think is optimized across all parameters. So let's talk a bit about Geroscience. This audience will know a lot about it, but we'll touch on it briefly. So the Geroscience Revolution reminds me historically of the antibiotics revolution in the early 20th century. So in the early 20th century, the doctors did not think that it would be possible to develop a magic bullet or silver bullet to actually cure infectious diseases. And infectious diseases are what killed most people at that time. But lo and behold, some breakthroughs were made. Methylene blue, for example, by Paul Ehrlich, or penicillin, discovered at my college in Oxford, no big deal, by Nobel laureate Howard Florey. And then we were off to the races with this chemotherapy approach. And antibiotics, by the way, as a discipline of pharmacology, have been so successful and have changed the structure of the human condition so much that it's actually the entire pharmaceutical development philosophy is modeled implicitly on antibiotic drug discovery, including for cancer. And we can get into that another time. So these are some of the pathways in Geroscience. This is from the Hallmarks of Aging paper. And this is an incomplete list, but the scientists among us will appreciate some of these. I think we should spend a lot more time thinking about DNA damage because very few groups are doing that, but it's really one of the primary apical drivers. This is out of date, but this list assembled by Apollo, they actually have a new list, which is really good, that is published on their blog, listing these interventions, genetic and pharmacological, that extend healthy lifespan across species. Here are some others ranked by effect size, ones that I really like. I want to draw your attention to ones that are off the beaten path, such as repair of gut barrier permeability and heterochronic bone marrow transplant, transplanting young bone marrow into old mice. And that's a foreshadowing for what's to come. So a snapshot of the Longbio ecosystem. This is not a complete list, but we'll talk about some of the major players. Of course, Healthspan Capital, early stage. Apollo Ventures, our friends and colleagues. Cambrian Biopharma, doing a lot of company building as well. These are some of the entities that I am or have been affiliated with. Collab, Vita and Molecule as well. But there are a number of other players in the space. This is not a complete list. Apologies if I left anyone out. These are some of the publicly listed companies that are somewhat longevity oriented, but not that many that are true, absolutely longevity oriented yet. There are some privately held companies in the space as well. This is an incomplete list. Go to longevity list for a complete list. Here are some on the top right, some of the companies that I personally launched in addition to Cambrian. And these are some more companies that have subsidiaries that are still in stealth mode that you should pay attention to. All right, so investor diligence for Geroscience. I'll speed through this relatively quickly because I've commented on this for my last year's Leaf Talk, but feel free to pause the slide. So what do you do to diligence these assets? Well, what I do is you look for new IP in various sources, and I'll get into the details of all of these points in a minute. You diligence the preclinical evidence, the science. I think that's the hardest part, personally. You do intellectual property strategy, come up with a development plan, the budget, Gantt chart, medchem, experimental protocols, clinical and regulatory strategy. And then once all of that is in place, you actually form a new co. You finish negotiations with the tech transfer office and launch the company and raise capital. And I gave a talk for On Deck Longevity Biotech Fellowship, in which I go into more detail here. But as a general overview, these are the categories I pay attention to: pharmacology, geroscience, commercialization, and then altogether that's translational attractiveness. So how do we define a long bio company? Well, it's pretty simple. You need some lifespan data, at least healthy lifespan or health span extension. And ideally in multiple model organisms. And it can be working on a pathway that is known to extend healthy lifespan as well. If you don't have a lifespan curve shift, you're not a full-fledged longevity company yet, so please endeavor to get that. And companies that ride the wave of longevity, the cachet, without actual lifespan or healthspan data are detracting from those approaches that actually have evidence, and that harms everybody. So this is something we should be vigilant against, and we'll get into that later. So how to read a lifespan curve or a Kaplan-Meier curve? It's really simple. You have the 50% lifespan extension, the median lifespan extension, and then the maximum lifespan extension here, and you can calculate that as a ratio. So every investor knows you're only as good as your deal flow. So these are some of the conferences and journals that I like. Journals are really underrated. It's a great source. You just reach out to the PIs or the first author. Conferences are good for science and business. TTOs can be hit or miss. Sometimes they're amazing, oftentimes not. NIH Grant Home is a good one that's been validated by a committee already. Inbound deal flow, once you have a bit of reputation, you can look through the patent database if you're a masochist like myself sometimes. But it's really a wide open playing field. It's amazing how few people from pharma or from VC are actually systematically going through these papers and finding these assets. We're very thin on the ground, which is a great opportunity for investors and founders. Here are some of the resources I like in longevity as well as in drug discovery broadly. We'll skip this, but basically suffice to say that preclinical drug discovery is pretty difficult. You have to be an expert in multiple disciplines and multiple types of assays, and it's just quite difficult compared to, say, clinical development or regulatory, which is pretty formulaic. There's a pathway for it, but everything is pretty different in the preclinical side. You can run a structured process for sourcing these assets using a checklist. Here's an example from a project I did at Apollo some years ago. And then you can rank them across these different parameters: pharmacology, aging, geroscience, IP, etc. So to give you an example of one of these, you can look at therapeutic index. This is a very simple and important metric in all of pharmacology and toxicology, which is the ratio between your therapeutic effect, EC50, and your toxic effect, or LD50, lethal dose. And you take that ratio, greater than 10 is pretty good. And so, there's a series of checklists that I use, developed over the years, that comes up with a scoring system, 617 points in total, as well as sort of a Gantt chart plan to actually launch these companies. If anyone's curious, I'm happy to share more info. IP diligence is very complicated. It's sort of beyond the scope of the talk now, but you can pause this and read the slide. Happy to talk more another time. You can also come up with your own valuation for these assets. So you can use an RNPV, risk-adjusted net present value, which increases in value as you de-risk the asset. And you can use these therapeutic area-specific probabilities of success, also from Andrew Lowe's group, to come up with these risk adjustment factors. Here's a very simple back-of-the-envelope one I did for an investment bank many years ago, and you ultimately come out with an RNP value per asset on a per asset basis, and then an aggregate for the company with this kind of approach. And then another really important aspect of company formation is your development plan and Gantt chart or budget. So it seems simple, but this is really where the rubber meets the road. You come up with all of the steps and all the dependencies for getting the asset advanced, and then a budget, of course. So now we'll talk about this new thing that we're unveiling for the first time today, what we call the legit Long Bio Checklist. Here's the first draft, certainly room for improvement. And what are the reasons why we need this kind of checklist? There are a couple existential threats to the longevity biotech field. The first one is a Theranos moment or moments, high-profile frauds and failures. So, I think the cat is out of the bag with respect to the field, and the snowball effect is mounting, so it's just going to get bigger and bigger from here. However, there are some things that can melt the snowball. And keep in mind that our lives literally depend on the pace of progress of this field. This field's gaining momentum. A couple things could stall it out. So the science is solid, but the major concern is reputation risk. So longevity was stalled for a long time because academics, pharmas, and investors feared being perceived as snake oil salesmen because it was just not a meme that longevity was real. Now it's hot and fashionable, and mark my words, I think it's going to be the hottest area of biopharma within the next 1 to 2 decades. But there's a risk, which is high-profile failures and frauds. So let's go through some examples. One, Theranos, bad blood. This held back the microliquid diagnostics field. It's a really good book, by the way, you should read. Exhibit B is lentiviral gene therapy in the 90s. There was Jesse Gelsinger and others who sadly died because there was not enough care taken in selecting the viral vector to be used in the first iterations of gene therapy, namely the lentiviral vector, which integrates it, inserts a gene somewhat randomly into the genome, and that can cause cancer. Held back gene therapy field for over a decade, which is now coming back with probably a little too much emphasis and enthusiasm and hype. And then third, which is very close to my heart, is the amyloid hypothesis on Alzheimer's disease, where there was this cabal of influential people who enforced this amyloid beta view for decades. Turned out to be false. Pharma has wasted billions of dollars, and people have been suffering from Alzheimer's much longer than probably is necessary. You can look up a talk in which I go into the details on YouTube. It's called Brain Aging, Biochemistry, and Therapeutics, given to the Oxford Neuroscience and Longevity Societies. All right, so the other existential risk are clout chasers, which are hogging the scarce capital and attention in the field. So for example, when the reputational hype goes too well, everybody and their mother claims to be a long bio company. We're going to start seeing that, and they divert capital and talent away from the real deal, who are not as self-promotional. So we need to promote and support the companies that are truly mission-aligned and not seeking to cash in on the cachet of longevity. A clout chaser, for example, is a term that the youngins use to refer to a person who associates with popular trends or people in an effort at self-aggrandizement and land grabs for power and influence, positioning themselves as thought leaders despite little history in the field or true expertise, like when Drake speaks in a Jamaican patois. So we need a rigorous set of criteria for what qualifies as hardcore long bio. So it's not just a matter of sheer opinion. So we've come up with this tentative list. So grade A, these are companies with drug-like compounds that extends wild-type mouse healthy lifespan by greater than 10% median lifespan extension, even when given to mice that are over 12 months of age or already old. So rapamycin is really the key example. This is very, very rare and valuable. I know of a couple other molecules like this, but they're still under wraps. Grade B are greater than 10% life extension, but when you give it to animals that are younger than 12 months. So they're not yet old. So you're giving it to them for a longer period of time. Astaxanthin is one of those. SGLT2 inhibitors are another example. Grade C, less than 10% lifespan extension, like metformin, acarbose, estradiol, et cetera. These lifespan results should be reproduced by at least 3 independent labs or by the NIA ITP program by Richard Miller and the team, which is kind of the gold standard. And then grade D, these are mechanisms of action, which are perfectly viable companies, by the way. Mechanisms of action where it's been shown genetically or pharmacologically to extend lifespan greater than 10% in wild-type animals. So autophagy enhancement, senolysis, telomere attrition, heterochronic bone marrow transplant, these all fall within that category. And probably most companies that we invest in fall within this category. Another grade E is where the mechanism of action is a hallmark of aging or something similar, but with less than 10% healthy lifespan extension in wild-type mice, or no lifespan extension evidence yet, such as Yamanaka reprogramming, which is still a little too early, and anti-inflammation like inhibiting NF-kappa B. Grade R are regenerative medicines lacking lifespan data, but have compelling data for enhanced function or health span later in life, like stem cell therapies, exosomes, or in situ stem cell activation. For any therapy to be a long biomedicine, it must have multi-morbidity reduction, coined by my colleague James Pyre from Cambrian, and has the potential to be a preventative medicine that enhances resilience before the disease becomes severe. For example, a drug that can only ever treat lung fibrosis is not a geroprotector unless the drug can also be label expanded to other indications and or is safe enough to be a prophylactic, such as metformin or rapamycin. And I should say that other mammalian models are also valid, like dogs or non-human primates, although those are harder to come by. So that's a first iteration of the list. Please reach out to us if you have any suggested amendments. We would like to open source this and have it be sort of a working document for everyone to use. All right, so closing thoughts and sermonizing. Call to arms for the field. You're only as old as your arteries, according to the physician Sir Thomas Sydenham from Oxford, UK. Cardiovascular disease kills 60% of us, and it's implicated in many other diseases, including neurodegeneration. So it's not enough to work on new mechanisms to target CVD, or there's not enough work in that space. And over 50% of all biopharma dollars go to oncology and rare diseases, but very little goes to cardiovascular disease, even though it's by far the leading cause of death and disability. So we need to do more of that. The animal models of disease are unreliable for age-related diseases. So there's a bottleneck in drug discovery for unreliable animal models of disease like Alzheimer's. My friend and colleague Jack Scannell coined the term E-Rooms law, and he is about to come out with a paper in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery about how your reliability of your animal model of disease is the most important single factor in the entire drug discovery pipeline. Slowing aging in wild-type animals is more robust and less contrived than these fake animal models of disease. A drug that enhances resilience by targeting the hallmarks of aging is likely to work for many age-related diseases and therefore to be a pipeline in a pill and a mega blockbuster. We need to do a lot more self-regulation and quality control in this space. The investors are supposed to be leading the charge on this. So we need to avoid high-profile frauds and failures, and we need to avoid clout chasers hogging attention and capital. And so using a rigorous definition like this allows everybody to agree on what are the most attractive approaches. And also, everyone should be original. So there are plenty of companies in the obvious areas like epigenetic clocks, analytics, CR mimetics. You should do something unusual. Go back in the literature and question the scientific dogma. Try something that has not been tried extensively before. Conversely, just because something seems obvious doesn't mean it's being pursued. An example of this is when I founded Samsara Therapeutics. This was early in the days of autophagy enhancement. There were very few groups working on this. And today, there are half a dozen or more autophagy enhancing companies out there. So just because it seems super obvious to you does not mean that it's actually being done. You have to do the research to see who's in that space. And it's always amazed me how few adults there are in the room, how few people are really taking a broad overview of the space and saying, this is where we need to focus our efforts. You'd think Big Pharma would do that, but they don't. They're very opportunistic in what kind of clinical assets come around. Another way we can incentivize this originality push is the Longevity Prize, which was just announced the other day. And the first one of this is an idea I came up with, which is the Hypothesis Prize. So we're giving 20K checks to people who go through the literature and find these ideas that are non-obvious but really promising. So one example of this that's become very hot is heterochronic parabiosis, where you surgically link the circulatory systems of an old and a young mouse. This was performed in the early 20th century, and then Irina Conboy in Tom Rando's lab and others now at Berkeley showed that this is an incredibly promising area of geroscience, and now it's become very hot and fashionable. And Irina just went back into the literature and found this and revived the technique. Another example is Coley's toxins in the early 20th century for rejuvenating or for inciting an immune response against tumors. That's now become the hottest area of biopharma, which is immune oncology today. And another example is cancer metabolism. Otto Warburg, one of the greatest biochemists of the last century, in 1920 showed that 80% of tumors do aerobic glycolysis. They ferment sugar even in the presence of oxygen. And that's a vulnerability that's shared across all tumor types, or many tumor types, that's only begun to be drugged really in the early 90s. And I think it's still underappreciated. So these are the kind of examples of things that have been known in the literature and maybe published in totally different languages that are not widely read or siloed, that should be revived and brought to our attention. Because right now it's sort of an echo chamber. Everybody is going after the same stuff. And Big Pharma does that a lot. And we want to avoid doing that in the longevity space. All right. And then I'm also helping launch a company called ImmuneAGE Pharma right now. And this is a platform company around immune system rejuvenation, particularly around hematopoietic stem cells. So if you want to know more about that, feel free to get in touch with me and I can share more info. So in conclusion, thank you everybody for listening. I hope you've learned something, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you are a company founder looking for investment, or you're a potential limited partner looking to invest in the space, or a fellow VC. So yeah, thanks again, and hopefully talk to you guys soon.